Hi, I'm Michelle Sterling for Friends of Science Society. The spring snowstorm of last week that brought life-giving precipitation for crops and farmers, plants, birds, the entire river valley, also brought down the branch of this beautiful tree. And in looking at it, I was reminded of a recent tweet that I saw with a young girl holding up a sign saying, "When the forest is gone, it's gone forever." Now, many of the climate strike kids don't really understand how the forest works or how forestry works. And I was reminded of a wonderful book by a late friend of mine, Jeffrey Foss. He wrote Beyond Environmentalism. And I think, although this book was written some time ago, I think it was published in 2009, and it took him about 10 years to write it, I think it's a very important work for everyone to maybe read today and consider. Jeffrey was a philosopher, professor of philosophy at University of Victoria. And in 1999, he rather innocently wanted to do a lecture called Why I'm Not an Environmentalist. And suddenly, campus security was warning him to take extra care, that there had been violent threats around. And he writes how he was so puzzled. He's just a philosopher, like who would care what he thinks? And all he's doing is expressing an opinion. Now, I found that very surprising because I wasn't associated with climate movement or climate science in any way back in 1999, and yet it sounds like many of the same things that are happening today were already happening then, the kind of cancel culture that's out there. So he writes in the book about how after his presentation he was visited by a number of different scientists who told him that in confidence they could speak to him, but publicly they could not. People who worked for the federal government who no longer felt safe expressing their professional expert views on things like forestry, on the fact that when you have a logging operation going on, the areas that's logged afterward is most vibrant with deer and bear and all kinds of wildlife and flowers and berries, because once the forest is cut down, the sunlight comes in and all that fertile soil renews itself, and all of the animals come back for all those wonderful herbs and vegetation that couldn't grow under a forest canopy. We have a professional forestry industry that replants trees. For every tree that's harvested, I believe it's 3 that are replanted. I'd like to read you some things from his book. His book didn't make the headlines when it was released. It was released as a trade book. So a few of his friends are going to try and make a copy of it available to the public. But let me just maybe read you a bit from what he wrote. He writes here that he got some emails from people working inside the national park bureaucracies of the US and Canada who were distressed by ongoing programs in which entire lakes and streams and even long stretches of rivers were being poisoned to kill all the fish. If this sounds strange from national park personnel, you're not up to speed on the latest environmental thinking. Strong poisons were used to kill all the fish, so these bodies of water could be restocked by native species that were there before the arrival of Europeans on the continent. The whistleblowers who were emailing me about these programs were too frightened to say anything publicly, but they thought perhaps I might stand up and do so. Another group of emails was from people whose land had been appropriated so it could return to a state of nature as part of a park or nature preserve. And they also hoped that Jeffrey Foss could publicize their plight, since the media seemed to be ignoring them. Of special interest was a letter from a geophysicist along with a sample of his publications. He explained that his research as a federal government scientist addressing the issue of climate change showed that the removal of forest by forestry and agriculture significantly raised surface temperatures, because this result could explain much of the observed rise in global temperatures. It thus challenged the view that global warming is caused by carbon dioxide emissions by humans. Although he was a contributor to the 1995 report of the IPCC, his work was now ignored, and as were his proposals for combating climate change. This was no surprise to him, since he'd been aware since the late 1970s that environmental activists had taken over the agenda of his governmental department. He wrote, "These people did not want the facts. They just wanted any environmental concerns unsupported by data to be put foremost. I was astonished." And there was a movement within the climate science to create and enforce a consensus around the carbon dioxide view. So his research had gradually been stopped and his funding denied. He asked me to keep this subject in the public eye. Jeffrey Foss will not be able to do that anymore because he passed away. But perhaps we can all keep his work going and help publicize the things that he no longer can. And I think it's fitting to read this passage. If you've ever wandered through a burnt forest, you'll witness far more thorough desolation than anything you'll see in a clear cut. After a forest fire, the trees, the shrubs, the grasses, the very soil itself is burned away, right up to the edges of streams and lakes. Nothing stirs. This is what nature does as part of her everyday business. By comparison, a logged forest is teeming with life, with rabbits, deer, and elk that come to munch on the newly verdant ground cover that had previously been suppressed under the dark forest canopy. But despite the desolation of the burned forest, despite the mournfulness that we feel among the charred trunks that stand like lonely sentinels, forest fires play a role in the natural cycle of death and renewal. It's difficult for us to accept death. Millions of years of evolution have ingrained in us a love of life and a horror of death. But we must remind ourselves that death is just the other side of the very same natural process that gave us life. Ephemeral creatures such as human beings tend to overlook nature's big picture. Whether it falls to the logger or lightning, the forest grows back, at least until the next ice age, which crushes it under miles of ice. And even then, after a few hundreds of thousands of years, the ice will retreat and the forest march again toward the poles. There's no wonder that we fail to notice this big picture, given that our lives occur in a flash against the almost inconceivably huge background it presents. I hope you'll read Jeffrey Foss' book, Beyond Environmentalism, A Philosophy of Nature, and remember him. For Friends of Science Society, I'm Michelle Sterling.